we laid a foundation for our Reformation series that might, at first glance, seem kind of out of place. In fact, in our discussion about it before we actually sat at the table, we actually wondered, should we go back in history and lay this kind of foundation? But again, just for those who are joining us in the discussion, and want to know where we're coming from, it's called the Reformation series, but it might seem kind of strange. They put in number one, they watch number one, and they think, well, where's the Reformation? Why aren't they talking about the Reformation? Well, in order to talk about the Reformation, we have to know what has gone before. We have to understand that something was deformed for it to need to be reformed. And so we're backing up in history, and in our first conversation around this table, we essentially said that all of the history that converges at the Reformation can be looked at as a conflict between two basic ways of thinking, two basically different ways of processing God and reality and human beings and their relationship with God. And what we were suggesting is that the God of the Scriptures, the God of both the Old and the New Testament, is a God of dynamic interpersonal relationship. That God is defined by covenant, by the idea of relational commitment, integrity, faithful love. Now, where we're going to go at this point is we're going to look at a prophecy, an amazing collection of prophecies actually in the book of Daniel, because the word covenant that we introduced in our last discussion figures prominently into the book of Daniel. The word occurs a number of times, and in the book of Daniel, what we basically see is that covenant defines the actions of the Messiah. That bridge we talked about between the Old and the New Testament. The God of the Old Testament is defined as a God of covenant. Jesus comes and fulfills all the promises of the covenant. Then in the book of Daniel, Jesus, or the Messiah, is defined as the one who fulfills covenant. And then here's the part that's of interest to Protestant Reformation. There's a power that is described in the book of Daniel who aligns itself precisely against the covenant. It is a power that is, according to Daniel's language, moved with rage against this idea of God as a God of covenantal faithfulness. It's an antinomian power. It's a power that is against God's covenantal interactions with human beings. So with that as a little bit of an introduction, let's just look at the prophecy that we're referring to in the book of Daniel. And we're going to look at Daniel chapter 7, and then we're going to loop into chapter 8, then into chapter 9, then also into chapter 11. And we're basically trying to pick up the word covenant, the usage of the word covenant in the book of Daniel, and the prophetic stage upon which this word is being dealt with by the prophet. So somebody take us to chapter 7 of Daniel.
Let's just touch on a few thoughts that can kind of connect our first session together with this. So we talked about how God is interpersonal. And I think it's interesting that the setting of Daniel is such that God is interpersonal, not just with the Hebrews, but with the entire world. That this vision we're going to look at here is in the first year of King Belshazzar, who was the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar, who Joel described as God's man to do a certain work at a certain time in a certain way. Remember we were talking about God has a purpose to covenant, not to covenant, but to reveal himself and to communicate and to be with humanity, and he has to use human people to He's accommodating, and that's what we see. The whole book of Daniel is set in that environment.
We can even say he uses people we'd never use.
Yeah, God is accommodating exactly, because what happens is when God uses certain people, and Jonah is a prime example of this, when God uses certain people, sometimes these people or people groups start becoming exclusive. They start thinking, oh, we're the special group, we're the special people. God is only using us. Jonah was
parochial, provincial, just us.
Oh, man. So God, I think the whole book of Daniel is setting up this idea that God's covenantal relationship is with more than just one people group. God is actually trying to communicate who he is and what he is, and the fact that he wants to be a friend and faithful to the whole world. And so we find Daniel in a very odd situation, talking about God's faithfulness and God's goodness and God's all this stuff in the context of being in a people group that look like that they've just been squashed by all of the powers that are in the world at his time.
Jerusalem is destroyed, the temple's destroyed, but God is faithful.
And it's not just one power, it's one after another after another. That's the setup. We've got Babylonians, then we've got Medo-Persians, then we've got the Greeks, then we've got the Romans. One after another has basically decimated these people that God has chosen.
People. I love that.
Yeah, bringing up what you brought up reminds me of something that's been really helpful for me in assessing history, especially with regards to the Protestant Reformation, but even in just interacting with people in general. And it's this, that as we go through this Reformation series, we're going to be talking about people with names who had certain positions, theological positions. And I think it's important that we not judge people, but rather judge ideas. Because any given individual that we might consider within the scope of history is going to be an individual. Luther, for example. Martin Luther, which is the key figure of the Protestant Reformation, is a guy that we look at, and there are points in his thinking where we might assess and say, that's just pure gospel brilliance. And there are other points in his thinking that we might say, that is so unbelievable that God would even have anything to do with this man. How could he be the guy? But as you keep reading Luther, you find out that there are points in Luther's experience when Luther would negatively assess a previous version of Luther. And I think around this table, even, I would assess a version of my own thinking at one point in my experience, and I could judge those ideas as bad ideas. But I remain in relationship with myself, obviously, and I don't cut myself off. So we're going to talk about Luther, we're going to talk about John Calvin, we're going to talk about Augustine, we're going to talk about Plato, we're going to talk about these historic figures. And what I've discovered is there's just brilliance in all of them. And at the same time, there are concepts that we would assess and say and push back on. But God is looking from a different vantage point and knows people's hearts and where they are in the process, so much so that you have someone like Zwingli, for example, Ulrich Zwingli, one of the main Protestant reformers, who actually at one point put people like Plato and Socrates and Aristotle, according to him, will be in the kingdom, will be in heaven. And yet, from our perspective, they knew nothing about Christ or the gospel. So how do you, God's got a way of working things out that we need to let God work out, and all we can do is judge ideas, not people.
That's a great caveat. Well said.
I mean, the first eschatological vision ever given to a human being wasn't given to a Hebrew; it was given to Nebuchadnezzar. Right?
Is that true?
Yeah, chapter 2 of Daniel. Yeah.
No, I was just thinking, okay, fair enough. When you just said eschatological.
You were thinking maybe Genesis 3:15.
Yeah, exactly what I was thinking.
I guess that's eschatological.
But it's equally true because that wasn't a Jew.
I would say that's a messianic prophecy.
Yeah, and another example of this is Luther's commentary on Revelation. In his first commentary on Revelation, he basically said this book doesn't belong as part of the canon. Shouldn't he be? Christ isn't even in this. He's not even mentioned in here. And I would take, what? 10 years later, he completely changes.
Yeah.
So I like that idea that we're not looking at men, we're not looking at the people, we're not looking at individuals, we're looking at the truth. We're looking at what was communicated, and we're judging and assessing and massaging it and seeking to move it along, move it along, and let the people who help even us do that, let them be part of that process, but let the process be focused on the actual truth.
I love everything that you said there. My favorite thing that you said, Ty, and all of that was, and you hinted at it, James, as well, that I would assess earlier versions of myself and negatively.
Me too.
Yeah.
You just had this great. You mean of yourself, James?
He means of you.
No, I gave him the benefit of the doubt. He's a Christian. You just had that great quotation, Jeffrey, a few days ago when you were speaking. Frank Burgess. If you have not, what was it, acquired or discarded a new opinion about something major in your life, you might check your pulse because maybe you're not alive anymore. Sometimes we have this notion, especially this takes place in sort of Christian circles, the idea that, what, you changed your mind? And that's the great thing about minds is that they can be changed, right? They're like tires, you can change them, or change it. But in some senses, we hold this notion that being static and unchanging is virtuous. Now, there are things about which we don't want to change our mind, but there are things in which if we're not growing, if we're not...
That's a sign of weakness, not strength.
Yeah, how is that a sign of strength? Where did we get that idea?
It's a sign of insecurity and arrogance in insecurity, isn't it? Because if I divulge a change in my thinking, that means I wasn't right.
The first time. You were right
You
the
weren't
first time.
in full possession of all knowledge about all things.
But I really like the way we're doing this, though, because we're not talking about, again, the individuals, we're talking about the truth itself. And so that makes it a lot easier for us to be able to switch because, oh, look, I didn't see that before. I mean, how many books have you read, and 5 years later you might reread it again, or even the Bible, and you read it again, you go, wow, I never saw it that way before.
So let me be autobiographical. We're talking here about Daniel 7, 8, 9, 11. Which we should say, we could do the rest of the series on that. Just those prophecies.
And we will.
In my own, we will, next time, let's do it. But in my own experience, I preached and taught, for example, Daniel 8 and 9 for years. Years. And what I was saying, I think, was true in terms of the basic facticity, the events, but in terms of the shape and the point, totally missing the point. I have no problem saying that. Like fully missing the covenantal, because as it had
Which
been taught
hurts
to
when
me,
that's actually the biggest.
well, that is, of course, and that's my point.
It's not like you missed, I missed that part of it. Like you missed the thing. You know, that hurts.
I just rest in the confidence that the people in the New Testament, Jesus says, man, you've been reading your book for a long time.
It's like getting married, but your wife wasn't involved.
Yeah.
And that was the point I was making earlier.
These are those which testify of me.
But the problem is that there's YouTube. And we can look you up and see all the crazy things you said. That's the problem.
And you.
Listen, I got tattoos on me. I have no problem with reminders that I have grown.
Okay, so Daniel, though.
I'm balding.
So Daniel,
And by the way,
Daniel
those
chapter
reminders are all
7.
through the Bible. For all of our authors, they're there. They're humans. We see growth in the progression of truth through the Bible characters. We see it, and of course we see it in Luther and others.
Yeah.
Anyway, sorry.
For sure. Okay, so what's going on first of all in Daniel 7? Who wants to dive into that and tell us the gist of the picture of Daniel chapter 7?
So Daniel chapter 7 is the second major vision in the book of Daniel. You have Daniel chapter 2, which many might know. Just go back briefly. It's a metal man, head of gold, chest and arms of silver, belly and thighs of bronze, legs of iron, feet of iron and clay.
That's Daniel 2.
Daniel 2. So that's basically the four kingdoms and the division of the fourth kingdom. So Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, Rome, then the division of Rome. So then you come to Daniel 7, you have something that is, in many ways, we probably don't need to establish those connections, but it's just a recapitulation of that. You have the lion, the bear, the leopard, the
Terrible beast.
terrible, ferocious beast, and then the 10 horns.
With more details.
So it's more details.
Yep.
So what you're dealing with is a historical movement from the time of Daniel down to the end. We call that eschatology, right? The study of the end of time, the end of things.
The last things.
Last things. And what you have is the lion, the bear. I think I've been through that. So Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, Rome. And in the middle of this element that happens in Daniel 7, the most important element in Daniel chapter 7 is not the lion, it's not the bear, it's not the leopard. It's this ferocious beast, this terrible beast, out of which comes these 10 horns. And one of those horns is the point that we're going to get at here, I think, Ty, and that is, this is a horn, a power that's speaking blasphemous words, it's persecuting the saints of the Most High, et cetera, et cetera. That's the focus. And Daniel, again and again, in Daniel 7 says, I was looking, Yeah, the lion was interesting. Yeah, the bear was interesting. Yeah, the leopard was interesting. But he
tell
was
me more
riveted.
about that little
That's
horn.
right. This little horn and the beast out of which the horn grew, he's just riveted. And that becomes the point around which Daniel 7 orbits.
We should actually read that. passage too.
Read that section.
Take us there, Jeffrey.
So, you want me to jump straight to the point you just made?
Yeah.
To the little
Go
horn.
to
verse 8. Or you
start
want me
in
to read the
7.
fourth?
No, just start in 7.
Verse 7, after this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a fourth beast, dreadful and terrible, exceedingly strong. It had huge iron teeth. It was devouring, breaking in pieces, and trampling the residue with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. I was considering the horns, and there was another horn, a little one, coming up among them, before whom 3 of the first horns were plucked out by the roots. And there, in this horn, were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking pompous words.
Okay, so then as you go through Daniel 7, there is a kind of repeat and enlarged pattern that takes place in which he returns to that little horn and he fills out what it looks like for it to have the eyes of a man and a mouth speaking great things. Because later on in the passage, he says in verse 23 that the fourth beast shall be the fourth kingdom on the earth, which shall be different from all the others, different from the ones before it, and it will devour, it will trample under its feet. So this is describing military conquest. And then verse 25, which gets real explicit and says that he will speak pompous words. And then this is added that wasn't in verses 7 and 8, against the Most High, and shall persecute the saints of the Most High. So that's a return to verses 7 and 8, but now it's filling out the picture. And I think what's brilliant here, really, is that if Daniel 2, with the metal man, with the gold, the silver, the brass, the iron, and the 10 toes, if that prophecy is being recapitulated in chapter 7 with the lion, the bear, the leopard, and the terrible beast, Daniel's prophecy specifically tells us what David mentioned a minute ago, that it's beginning with the kingdom of Babylon. So all you have to do is just lay your Bible aside for a second, just look at history, and history will tell you that the kingdom of Babylon was followed by Media-Persia, which was followed by Greece, which was followed by the Iron Monarchy of Rome. And if you keep reading history, you see that Rome, the Roman Empire, gave way, just like this prophecy says, to another configuration of power that, according to this prophecy, is different than all the others that were before it. And that power that, according to history, that followed the pagan Roman Empire was the formation of the Roman Church, the papal Roman state, which took up the position that had been previously occupied by the Roman Empire in its pagan phase. So if that trajectory is
accurate,
and we believe it is accurate, because Daniel's prophecies have told us, hey, everybody, we're beginning with Babylon.
So
but it's
accurate.
interesting that each one of those previous kingdoms were overcome, overtaken, conquered by another kingdom.
Yeah.
And then that fourth one is not.
No,
Yeah.
it actually slips in to the vacancy that's created by the Roman emperors.
It's almost like a continuation.
It is.
It is a continuation.
It is.
Different
That's why it's one
phase.
beast.
Yeah.
Isn't
And
it?
if you go back to Daniel 2, the iron goes right through to the toes.
Right.
There's never, when iron appears, it never
Yeah,
is
it just
not
adds
on
the
the
clay,
scene.
but it doesn't. Yeah,
And this horn is not detached from the beast. It grows out of the fourth beast.
Okay, we need to take a break, but we've already established a crucial foundation for where we're going. There is a succession of empires brought to view in this prophecy, and it lands somewhere in history with a particular power that tells us exactly what the great falling away, the great apostasy looks like, that necessitates the Protestant Reformation, which is where we're going. So let's just take a break and we'll come back.
Want a seat at the table? Well, you're certainly invited. Visit our website at lightbearers.org. In fact, you may want to make it your homepage, because we're always adding something new to strengthen your relationship with Jesus. At lightbearers.org, you'll find thought-provoking blogs and verse-by-verse Bible studies on a variety of vital topics. Our online resource center has an excellent lineup of books, CDs, and DVDs that present God's Word with clarity and power. Our presenters include Jeffrey Rosario, James Rafferty, David Ashery, Ty Gibson, and more. We also maintain an archive of audio and video messages you can access free of charge. Feel free to listen online or download to your computer, tablet, or smartphone. Under Events, you'll discover locations and dates where ministry events will be held throughout the year. We'd love to see you. If you felt a personal call to ministry, our Arise School will help get you going. We have training programs that vary from 9 days to 13 weeks. Click on the Learn More link for more details about each program. Stay up to date with the latest sermons, media, news, and events by subscribing to our monthly newsletter. If you'd like to help us continue producing gospel resources, please donate using our convenient and secure webpage and receive a tax-deductible receipt. We're here to serve and equip you in sharing your passion for Christ and the global advancement of His benevolent kingdom. Lightbearers.org. There's room at the Lightbearers table for you.
So for those who might not be familiar with the prophecies of Daniel, we probably covered that really fast.
Okay.
But what we want to simply point out is that the book of Daniel opens up a series of prophecies that are covering the same basic period of history and dealing with the same basic powers in history. That's not to say that there aren't other empires, other places in the world. It's just saying that Daniel is saying, hey, there is going to be a succession of empires, and the whole point, as James called our attention to last segment, the whole point is to really get to that power that most of the time is given to. Babylon is just mentioned in some of its characteristics. Media Persia is mentioned with 2 or 3 of its characteristics. Greece is mentioned with a few of its characteristics. But Daniel even himself at one point says, I want to know the truth. I want to know the truth about that little horn power. And that's the one that stands out in his thinking. He's like, tell me about that. And so most of the details in chapter 7 and chapter 8 are about that power. So what is this power? First of all, what power is this in history? Which we don't have to do a lot of guesswork. It's definitely the papal Roman Empire. How do we know that for certainty? Well, within Daniel's own context, if we begin with Babylon, again, lay the Bible aside. So this isn't just an internal biblical idea. The Bible is telling us what actually happened in history. That power followed that one, which followed that one, which followed that one. And that one, the Roman Empire, gave space for the continuation of the Roman Empire in a new form. In a new form. Pagan to papal.
And when we say gave space, historically what that looks like, you know, this is symbolic language. What that looks like in that particular case, the fourth beast ceding ground or giving space to the little horn, is what we would call the dissolution of the Western Roman Empire, right? By the time you get toward the end of the 5th century, Rome, as we think about it, right, Rome in the movies, it's gone.
Yeah.
It's fragmented, which is, you know, hugely significant because what you have in Daniel 2 is the feet of iron and clay, fragmentation, and what you have here in Daniel 7 is the beast that has 10 horns, fragmentation. So that's what it looks like historically speaking, is you have the dissolution of the Western Roman Empire, which creates a power vacuum, right? The homogenizing influence in the ancient world up to that point was the imperial reality of Rome. When that's gone,
What's
what
next?
is the thing?
Yeah.
Well, about 150 years before, a fellow by the name of Constantine the Great had converted to Christianity. He had become the first of the Christian Roman emperors. So that's AD 312. When you get down to AD 476, and now Western Rome is gone as an empire, there is still an adhering, gluing, homogenizing, maybe that's not the best word, but there's something that's giving a connectivity to what had been the Roman Empire, and that's the church.
Yeah.
That's the church. So now you transition, this is a little future, but you come into what's called the Holy Roman Empire.
Yeah.
Right, out of just Rome to the Holy Roman
It's
Empire.
Rome 2.0.
Rome 2.0.
And it carries over some of the characteristics from the imperial Rome.
Yes.
Just like the
that's what
prophecy
we're looking
predicts.
at.
The prophecy predicts that this fourth kingdom would be the fourth kingdom. Wouldn't be a fifth kingdom or sixth kingdom. So the Holy Roman Empire, to connect it with the prophecy, it continues to be, it is a continuation of that fourth
And
power.
it's the only one that contains, correct me if I'm wrong, but there's spiritual stuff, religious stuff wrapped
That's
up.
why it says it's diverse.
Yeah, it's wrapped
different.
up in that last one, and you don't really see that in the first three.
Well, Ty alluded to that. When you get to verse 25 of Daniel chapter 7, it doesn't just say he will speak pompous words,
Right.
period. He will speak pompous words against the Most High. Not just that he will be a persecuting power, but he will persecute the saints of the Most High. And then this is where it gets really pregnant. He shall intend to change times and laws. Well, whose
the Most
time?
High.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Of the Most High. The saints will be given into his hand, and he will rule for a time, times, and a half a time. You know, by the way, that there is a celestial dimension to what's you're moving from the terrestrial or the horizontal to the vertical, the celestial. You know that because in Daniel 7, repeatedly, the thing that brings an end to the career of this persecutorial, blasphemous career of this power is the judgment, the heavenly judgment seats. It's not another military power that comes in like you have with the succession of Babylon, Media, Persia, Greece. Verse 26 says, but the court will be seated, and they, that is to say the heavenly court, will take away his dominion to consume it and destroy it forever. So you transition, I love what you say there, Jeffrey, from a mere horizontal conquering of nationalistic kingdoms to a vertical orientation toward God. Blasphemy against God, against God's law, against God's times, against God's people. Yeah. And no power on earth is going to say, okay, no, the heavenly court convenes and says, okay, we got work to do.
Yeah. It's amazing. When you realize this, it's so huge because essentially what we're saying is that Daniel's prophecies foretold the formation of apostate Christianity.
We got to unpack that. That's true. What you're saying is exactly true, but I think we need to put flesh on that a little bit.
Put flesh on it.
Okay,
David.
so I just mentioned Constantine the Great. My understanding, and I'm happy to be corrected on this or at least modified on this, is that you have, during the apostolic period, so when we mean that, we say first century Christianity, apostolic period, Book of Acts. Then you move into the second and third centuries, and this is what's sometimes called the ante-Nicene period or the patristic, the early period, early Christianity. All the apostles are dead, post-apostolic, but we are not yet to the conversion of Constantine, that period there. Right? That's going to happen at the beginning of the 4th century. So that period there is a period in which the church is going reasonably well, I think, by comparison, right? Things are going well, there's baptisms, there's conversions, but as soon as we get to the conversion of Constantine, this is giant, you now transition, the church transitions from a persecuted minority in the Roman Empire. Overnight, you are now
official.
You are the official empire. You are the religion of the
church.
empire.
Yeah.
You go from a percentage of population like 3 to 2 to 4% of the Roman Empire, and now you're like 70%. Because this is now the favored church. This is the new religion of Christianity. And you could say it this way. In those early formative centuries, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, the Christian church survived persecution. They survived adversity. They survived obscurity. Could they survive popularity?
Yeah, that's the question.
Right? So now all of a sudden, the Christian faith is the faith.
Now ministers are being funded by the empire. Now churches are being funded. Now there's no martyrs. So it just totally changes the entire identity and culture of Christianity.
It just changes the whole shape. The culture of Christianity is shaped. It goes from persecuted to politically powerful.
Yeah. Right. So you have the Roman Empire, which is persecuting apostolic Christianity. And then suddenly you have Christianity now becoming the Roman Empire persecuting Christianity. It's just this major transition of power in which the Christian church is undergoing monumental changes on a political and ideological level and on a theological level. And the theology is the crucial thing that Daniel has in mind. Because if you continue marching through Daniel's prophecies, you see in chapter 8 that this same little horn power is described as growing up to the hosts of heaven.
Yeah.
This power casts some of the hosts to the ground. Again, it's persecuting
You're in verse
the
10.
saints. Yeah, I'm in verse 10 of chapter 8 of Daniel. And then it says in verse 11 that he exalts himself even as high as the prince of the hosts. That's the Messiah.
That's Messiah.
And then it says that he casts the daily and the sanctuary to the ground. In verse 12, it says that he casts the truth, that's the gospel, to the ground, and he prospered in doing it. I mean, the words,
Clearly, this is not horizontal.
Words could not be more explicit. You have here Rome 2.0 taking on a Christian guise, becoming Christianity of the popular empire, and in the process of practicing and prospering, it is taking the truth of the gospel, and back in chapter 7, verse 25, the truth of God's law, the law and the gospel, and bringing those things down in people's understandings and estimations.
Morphing them.
It's just amazing. And then in chapter 9 of Daniel, Daniel's prophecy backs up. Check this out. And describes the time when Jesus is on the scene himself in chapter 9, verses 24 through 27. When Jesus is on the scene, that's during the pagan phase of the Roman Empire. Jesus was crucified on a Roman cross.
Right. Stood before a Roman procurator.
That's right. So when Jesus comes, this is fascinating. When Jesus comes, he's specifically described in chapter 9, verse 25 as Messiah the Prince, which is the language that was used similarly in chapter 8, okay, that this power that's future to him, yeah. And then in chapter 9:27, it says that the primary action of Messiah
this is huge.
Is to confirm the singular, the covenant. And in a Hebrew context, that's essentially saying that when the Messiah came to this world, his whole mission was to confirm as true the character of God's covenantal love toward the human race.
The Hesed we talked about in session 1.
So he proved faithful to the promises that were made through all the prophets. So that's the key characteristic in Daniel of the Messiah. He fulfills covenant. Then, when you come to chapter 11, that same power is described under different language, but first, we have an actual description. This is fascinating. Chapter 11, verse 22 describes the crucifixion of Jesus.
Yes.
And specifically names the one who is crucified the Prince of the Covenant.
Love it.
So that's his identifying nomenclature. This is who Jesus, he's the one who proves the faithfulness of God's covenantal love to the human race. And then in chapter 11, verse 30, it says that same power back there that we talked about in chapter 7 and chapter 8 now postures itself with rage against the Holy Covenant, and he's going to do damage. And verse 32, those who do wickedly against the covenant, he shall corrupt with flattery. And this is the bridge, as I understand it, you guys correct me if I'm wrong here, this is the bridge between pagan Rome and papal Rome. This is describing both the pagan phase and the papal phase are against the covenant, right?
Correct.
And the pagan phase, secular Rome, if you will, crucifies the Prince of the Covenant. And the papal phase takes up the cause of the pagan Roman Empire that crucified the covenant Messiah by continuing against the people of God in persecution, against the law of God and against the covenant.
Against the sanctuary, against the truth.
So that's just a lot of language. For those who are sitting in with us here in this conversation, I just took, the big sweep of the usage of covenant. Now, maybe we should slow down, back up now, and say, okay, so what exactly are we saying took place in history? That's what the prophecy says. So in real time in history, what actually took place?
I love the way you're saying that, Ty, because you said something there that was so true, and that is that Daniel's primary concern is what we would call a theological concern. Like this is the language of theology: blasphemy, waging war against God, against His law, against times, against the covenant. That's all theological language. So I like the idea here that the basic orientation of heaven to what's happening here is not militaristic, it's not national, it's not horizontal, it's vertical.
Those are just manifestations.
Those are manifestations of a larger spiritual reality that's taking place.
Yeah.
That's key to bear in mind.
Right.
And the text goes to great lengths to communicate that transition from the terrestrial to the celestial, or from the horizontal to the vertical. It does that in really clever ways in Daniel 7, which we sort of looked at there, against blasphemy against. But even in Daniel 8, you have those first three powers there moving
in
north, south, east, west, these sort of directions. And then all of a sudden, I think you actually read this for us, Ty, in 8:10 or 8:11, he magnified himself to the prince of the host. That's up.
Yeah.
So
That's up. How do you do that?
Well, we've been talking about how, in order to understand
with
what
the theological system,
what needs to be reformed, we're talking about the Reformation, and that implies that something was deformed. And so,
I'm sorry, could you just start that over again?
In our discussion and framing this whole series, we're talking about the Reformation, but that implies something was deformed. And so in this sweep that we're doing, this prophetic sweep, it would be helpful to, what does that mean? What are we saying? What fell? What was the fall, right? In Christianity that we're describing. And this whole idea of horizontal and now it's pointing up toward God. It sounds like in some way it's the repositioning of what's at the heart of Christianity. And now it seems that man is slowly usurping where God's place was originally. Is that a fair, basic foundational way to explain what happened? Well, what happened was there were different dynamics and processes that took place where man was slowly gravitating towards the center where God really belongs, and out of that flow many different theological, sociological, political. All of this really flows from that one truth.
And when we come back, we'll take a break here. When we come back, I want to talk about how that happened. How do you get that more man-centered, human-centered? What does that look like? You're exactly correct. The prophecies are intimating that. What did that look like down on the ground level?
All right, we'll come back in a minute then.
A Light in Zambia is a moving video documentary that traces the stories of 5 amazing African men and women who encountered Christ through the powerful medium of gospel literature. To receive your free copy, call 877-585-1111 or write to Light Bearers, 37457 Jasper Lowell Road, Jasper, Oregon 97438. Once again, to receive your free copy of A Light in Zambia, call 877-585-1111 or write to Light Bearers, 37457 Jasper Lowell Road, Jasper, Oregon 97438. Simply ask for the Zambia DVD.
So we're in Daniel chapter 7, we looped into chapter 8, we went into chapter 9, we went into 11. That's a lot of stuff that we just covered, especially for those who are sitting in on this conversation with us. But we really can just boil it down to a very simple idea. Daniel's prophecies are telling us that there will be a succession of empires in history that will land with a final empire that will align itself against God. That's essentially what Daniel's prophecies are telling us. And it will align itself against God in very, very specific ways that are named. It will align itself against the covenant. And the covenant in Scripture is a really big idea that includes the gospel, it includes the law of God, it includes the entire package of God's faithfulness in the way He relates to people. So essentially, there's a power that's aligning itself against what God is doing in history, and it's setting up a parallel and an optional
System.
But I think what's interesting about that is when you say against God, it doesn't necessarily have to go on the offensive.
Yeah.
All it has to do is meddle with the fact that God is central to this,
Obscure.
and begin to replace it with man.
That's how you ended. That's how you
By
ended the last
default,
session.
that is going against God.
So speak to that.
We keep emphasizing it's a theological matter. It's a theological matter. So the power that's being described, we're not looking for something that's actively going and attacking God, per se. We're looking for something that by nature of its theological orientation obscures the centrality of God
and of God's covenantal faithfulness.
Yeah, by blurring the lines between man and God. And so that's where the attack really is.
Okay,
is
so
at.
maybe this is where you want to go, maybe it's not where you want to go, but my understanding of how that worked, historically speaking, go back to the conversion of Constantine. So actually, let me just go back before that. The Christian movement grew rapidly. We see that in the book of Acts. You have 3,000, 4,000 being baptized. So there was a growth there, but relative to the larger Roman Empire, it was, you wouldn't say insignificant, but it wasn't like, whoa, these Christians are everywhere. They were a fairly small power, right? Or a fairly small entity. Power is the wrong word. Until you get to the conversion of Constantine, and I think I mentioned that before, you go from a very small percentage, 2 to 4%, I'm talking Jews and Christians both, and then all of a sudden you're 60, 70% of the Roman Empire is now Christian.
Yeah.
Okay, well now, just by virtue of that, bishops and archbishops and people that occupy spiritual positions now just have more authority they just have more influence in these given areas. And there were, in sort of the history of 2nd, 3rd, and 4th, 5th century Christianity, you had emerging centers of influence. So one of those centers was Jerusalem, for obvious reasons. Another emerging center is Rome, also for obvious reasons. Alexandria, later Constantinople. These are your major, bishoprics? Is that the term? Bishoprics. These are your centers of Christian influence, and because they didn't have like what we have today, telephones and Instagram and Facebook and easy communication, each of these areas took on its own flavor, its own sort of, it was adding its own look, its own feel, its own flavor or seasonings to the Christian faith. And in that sort of fraternal competition to place their stamp on what Christianity looked like, Rome will emerge.
Yeah.
It won't be the church in Jerusalem. It won't be the church in Constantinople. It won't be the church in Alexandria. Rome will emerge. And in the emergence of Rome, as the church is growing, you go from, hey, that guy's the pastor. Now you have bishops. Then because Christianity was mainly an urban movement, right? 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries. This is an urban movement, not a rural movement. Now you have 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 bishops, 11 bishops, 12 bishops in a town, in a city. Well, now you need an archbishop, who's somebody who oversees, and very subtly, but almost necessarily, you have the emergence of a very strong hierarchical system. Okay? Now, by the time this works its way out, you get to the 5th and 6th centuries, we're going to end up with a head of all of the heads of the heads of the...
And the point there, David, is why follow that model? Because what example did the church draw from? In its religious phase, what example would papal Rome draw from in order to structure the church? It would draw from imperial Rome.
I was wondering exactly.
It would draw from Caesar's realm and kingdom. And so you have these systems of power that we're saying there's a blurry line between pagan and papal. So this
church
concept of this concept just gets transferred over to the Christianity version of Rome, and so you see the same power structures, also the same idea transferred.
So, for example, when Constantine converts, and I use conversion in quotations here because there's theological or historical debate about what the nature of that conversion was. But when he converts, he now rules the bishops of Christianity in an analogous way or a similar way to the way that he rules his procurators, governors of the empire. So now a byproduct of the conversion of Constantine is the mingling, almost incarnationally in one person, Constantine in this case, of church and state. That will become, that is the, here the Christian church is catching a cold, that it still has to this day.
Mm-hmm.
And what you're describing as that cold, a minute ago, the way you said it was really helpful for me, and that is that suddenly Christianity possesses power that it never had before. And that's what Daniel's getting at. Daniel is saying not only does the Christian church begin to have power it never had before, but it begins to use that power in the way that the Roman Empire used power, and that's in this language, that it spoke pompous words against the Most High, persecuted the saints of the Most High God, and changed the times and laws of the Most High God. So in other words, the Christian church begins to use the power of force, coercion, the sword, in order to enforce its belief systems. So now you have this very strange situation in which, see if this makes sense, the covenant that comes to us through the line of the law and the prophets, Hebrew thought, is by definition reciprocal love, faithfulness from God, eliciting faithfulness
in response
on a free will basis.
Thank you.
And suddenly, now we have a power that is displacing covenantal reciprocity with God with coercion and force and the threat of punishment if you don't comply with God. So now, so now, by the use of the sword, by the use of force, military, what's happening is the covenant is in fact being destroyed in the minds of people. That's where it's taking place. Like you were saying earlier, Jeffrey, it's in the minds of the people that they're seeing God now in a different light. He used to be a God of covenantal faithfulness, seeking free response. Now he's a God who's standing over with the sword and saying, convert or die.
One of the very first things that Constantine did, and I keep coming back to him maybe because I know most about him, and that's sort of the area of church history that I'm most familiar with, but one of the very first things that he did, he felt that he had been called by God, and there's debate about whether or not he didn't even renounce all of his other various gods, but that's beside the point. He said, we need to unite Christianity, and so they convened the Council of Nicaea, the first, and some would say the most definitive council in the history of Christianity, AD 325. And the purpose, this is coming off of that, the primary purpose is to get unified creedally, doctrinally on the point, there's a number of points, but in particular the relationship of Jesus to the Father, so that they could color people outside of the lines. Yeah. And the implication is
that's heresy, that's heresy. Yeah.
So you see that it's not free will, it's not voluntary, it's not growth that we talked about at the beginning of this session. It's compulsory, it's orthodox, it's dogmatic, there's no choice. What?
Yeah.
And now because you have that whole witch's brew, that mingling of the church with the state, hey, what do you mean he believes the wrong thing? Bring him over. Right? You're just importing that way, that militaristic, coercive way of dealing with spiritual matters. And the language I'm using here is that Christianity caught a cold that it will have all through the Christian emperor period, all through what we refer to as the medieval period, all through the modern period, even now into the postmodern period.
It showed up among the Protestant reformers themselves, who were struggling to understand grace and love and freedom, and were on a course in that direction, but themselves were engaged in persecution of those who didn't agree with their particular formulation of theology. And we have a manifestation of that today in what is oftentimes referred to as the Christian right, which is really no longer a thing presently. That language isn't being used so much. But this idea that Christianity constitutes a political voting bloc that can impose upon the broader culture its will by political process.
And
so it's another manifestation.
This is probably, we're going to get there eventually, but the reason that the religious right of the Christian right has ceased to exist in some, that language isn't really the language. That's only by virtue of the times in which we live. If people could have the authority that oh, hello,
they'd use it.
of course they would.
Yeah.
So it's just a product of the times in which we live that we don't see the manifestation of that basic spirit of how the church relates to the state in relationship to
All
others.
that's needed is an is Constantine. Constantine shows up, and there it is.
Yeah, the difference between the covenantal God of Scripture and everything else that we're talking about that Daniel's prophesying of is that God possesses power, holds it in reserve in favor of freedom so that love can exist.
Thank you. Yes.
Whereas the thing that Daniel's foretelling is, can any human organization or institution or system or power, can any human organization possess power and refrain from using it to force conscience?
History would say no.
History would say no. As soon as you have the power, you want
Power
to encroach.
tends to corrupt.
Yeah.
Absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Yeah.
What I love about this, and I guess all of us here at this table, converts to the Christian faith, right? In other words, not raised in strong Christian homes, right? Mm-hmm. For me, back in 1996, 1997, when I'm coming to faith, about 20 years ago, the thing, perhaps more than anything, that just impressed me, that just settled on my mind, were these prophecies about the shape of history. This is what history will look like. It will be shaped like this. Okay, now the prophecies of Daniel, for example, given some 500 to 600 years before the time of Jesus. Okay, Jesus is 2,000 years ago. Here we are 2,000. So you're talking 2,600 years of human history, 2,600 years of human history. And Scripture is saying this is the shape.
Yeah.
Look for this shape. And so we're walking around with a sort of template. It's like, oh.
Yeah. And sure enough, it shows up.
Come on. We were talking earlier before the session started, Jeffrey and I think one of you might have been in that as well, about how people in various, sort of scholastic and academic circles deny the prophetic intentionality of the book of Daniel. They say, no, come on, there's no prophecies there. That's not, you believe that? But, for me, forgive me for being, maybe a bit of naivete here, but the proof is in the pudding. It's like, this is what history will look like. And here we are with the luxury as we have of historical perspective, and that is what history looks like? Is this a happy coincidence? And somebody could say, well, that's just your interpretation. But as we're going to see in this series, that interpretation has been the interpretation of people down through the ages. This is not just something that David, Jeffrey, James, and Ty came up with.
Right.
That feel for the shape of human history, from something formed, something deformed, something reformed.
Yeah.
This is mind-blowing.
Yeah. And just internally in Daniel itself, as we already mentioned before, but it bears repeating, Daniel's prophecies specifically name and identify Babylon as the first power in the succession of powers. So again, you can back up.
It tells you where to start.
It tells you where to start. It says Babylon.
And then it says Medo-Persia.
It actually names Medo-Persia.
And then it says Greece.
He's basically saying, when you get to the library, start in this aisle.
That's right. That's right.
Start here.
Yeah.
So, which means that if you follow the succession of powers through, you end up with what Daniel describes as a power that has certain characteristics that aligns itself against the activities of God in the world through His church.
And the shorthand for that is covenant.
That's right.
The shorthand, that's how we're using it here. The shorthand for God's activities in the world, whether Old Testament or New Testament in Christ, covenant. That's what we mean.
Yeah. And shorthand for the activities of this power against God, rage against the covenant. It's diametrically opposed to God relating to people in this dynamic, interactive, reciprocal manner in which love is sustained as the connection between God and His creatures.
We sometimes refer to that as the love, risk, freedom, responsibility paradigm. The idea that, you have to have freedom in order to have love, you have to have risk in order to have freedom. This idea that God is relating to us, as we talked about in the first session, I loved that. Abraham, he's coming down. There's this accommodationist principle. He's with us. He's proximate to us. He's adjacent to us. This notion, and it's so interesting because not only with the sword, but with the pen, we're going to see scholastically that notion is going to be, no, God is not next to, adjacent, proximate. He's... So there's going to be a war against Christian against Christianity on so many levels. And the mind-blowing thing is that it will come at the hands of the Christian church.
Yeah.
That's the bombshell.
That's the bombshell he's pointing to here, isn't it?
Yes.
The issue is within, not without.
Yeah, Daniel actually foretells the formation of fallen Christianity occupying the position of imperial Rome and the building of this monolithic system that exists in history, plain for anybody to see. There it is, for over 1,000 years, doing certain actions in history, like persecuting in the name of Jesus, like speaking great words of theological pronouncements that are directly against the principles of the gospel.
And in our next session, we're going to go to a New Testament passage that is based on, riveted to Daniel 7, 8, 9, and 11 in the writings of Paul, where this isn't just Jeffrey, David, James, Ty. Paul is going to say, hey, that whole Daniel thing, you need to understand that.
That's right. Yeah.
That's the shape of what the Christian church looks like, or this power looks like through the ages.
So I guess we've titled this session "Rage Against the Covenant," grounded in Daniel, and we have allowed the prophet to open before our understanding a clear sense of where we are in history prior to the launching of the Protestant Reformation. So next session is going to be exciting.
Explosive.